Okay, we seem to be ready to go. Hi, everyone. Hello. My name is Reinhold Martin. I'm a member of the Committee on Global Thought. I teach architectural history and theory in the School of Architecture, but I'm here principally to very quickly introduce to you my colleague from CGT, fellow CGT member Ben Orlove. And I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as possible. So just to introduce Ben to you, he is, I think many of you know, a professor of international and public affairs here at Columbia at SIPA. He's an anthropologist who's conducted fieldwork in the Peruvian Andes since the 1970s and has also carried out research in East Africa, the Italian Alps, and Aboriginal Australia. His early work focused on agriculture, fisheries, and rangelands. More recently, he studied climate change and glacier retreat with an emphasis on water, natural hazards, and the loss of iconic landscapes. And in addition to his numerous academic articles and books, his publications indeed include a memoir and a book of travel writing, so much to read. Ben he taught, prior to coming to Columbia, he taught for many years at the University of California, Davis, UC Davis. And here at Columbia, he also teaches in the master's program in climate and society, a very important sort of kind of, let's say, fellow master's program to the CGT program, for which he serves as an associate director. He's a senior research scientist at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, and is one of the 4 co-directors of the Center for Research in Environmental Decisions. And Ben is actually here in a kind of return visit to these lunchtime seminars. I guess it was a couple of years ago, excellent and really informative and illuminating discussion about the language of climate politics, really, and policy. And today, Ben's going to speak to us about the concept of adaptation. So I will hand it over to Ben, and we'll speak for a while, and then we'll open for Q&A after that. Ben.
Well, thanks very much, Reinhold. And, thanks to the whole program for creating this opportunity. Reinhold, you mentioned my last talk focused on the language of climate change and climate change policy, and we'll be hearing a bit about the imagery as well here, the visual imagery. And so I was actually invited to write an article on the concept of adaptation, annual review of environment and resources as kind of environmental policy outlet, and this seemed perfect. I liked, matches very well the CGT. I think it's very global. I mean, here's climate change, which happens on a planetary scale, and international negotiations are really important in the climate space. You have different countries getting together, close to 200 of them, having to work out all these agreements. And the thought is really important, that I did mention words, and there's just so much talk around climate change, both the research and the negotiations. People have to kind of figure out what is this climate change and what are its pieces, and adaptation is certainly one of them. And in a way, it's striking because adaptation seems like you don't even need to stop to think about it. These are some images of New York City during Hurricane Sandy back 2015, I believe. The power was out mostly below 34th Street for weeks. Subway was flooded, homes were flooded. So that's the climate change impact. We want there to be less of this, but we're already facing this now. So what do? Is we adapt. In some places you raise houses, you can see you build seawalls, and the map of the city shows a kind of policy response of demarcating different hazard zones, developing policies that could involve changing insurance, trying to buy out houses there. So there are climate change impacts, there's adaptation. Like, okay, we get it. There's stuff we've got to do. But I really want to talk about the history here, and it's one of the things I most value about the Committee on Global Thought is the way of discovering different histories, as we were just chatting the history of petroleum before the talk began. So this is the history that some of you may know. There was attention to climate in the 1970s, the first World Climate Conference in '79. that broadly gave rise to two international organizations, both affiliated with the UN. There's the IPCC, which I've worked on two of those reports, began in '88, and just 4 years later. So that's doing the science. That's like, what do we know about what has happened? What do we project what will happen? And then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change sets up international agreements. It's a framework in which things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement can take place. Every year, all the countries send their representatives, kind of hammer things out in advances bit by bit. So that's the international framework set up like 30 years ago. So adaptation wasn't there from the beginning. It kind of took a while to come in. Mitigation arrived first. I do have various bits of text of the document here. I am not expecting you to read all of these, just to see that this starts for the UN Framework Convention. The ultimate objective of this convention, any related legal instruments that the Conference of the Parties may adopt, this is like diplomatic language, certainly going back to the 19th century. And what it seeks to do is stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Those are the gases that are causing the warming, and we know they're bad, and we want to stabilize them at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system, anthropogenic, caused by humans. So this is like, okay, too much gases, we're going to stop them. That's the mitigation. The mitigation is taking care of the gases. This language from 1992 is both enormously enabling because it's quite broad. It's challenging in some ways. This idea of stabilization before the danger occurs, boy, that's hard, particularly because there wasn't much danger that they'd seen in 1992, so you sort of got to think about that. And well, anyway, mitigation came first. Adaptation came in later, partly because mitigation didn't go as quickly as people wanted. The emissions weren't reduced, and there were more impacts than people thought. The voices were not unanimous. It was the developing countries that said that they had to bring in adaptation. And there was an argument against that. Like, let's not even think about adaptation. That's a moral hazard to mitigation. It's like, let's go on a diet and not do liposuction. It's let's develop the vaccine before not worry about the masks. And so many people thought, looking at adaptation, saying like, look, we can get away with this. Don't worry about the warming, we'll just adapt. So this was the first of the tensions. So you'll be seeing that I'll talk about some tensions, and that was the first. Some of the mitigation people didn't want to bring in the adaptation, and others were pushing for it. But these IPCC reports began to have glossaries. They got longer and longer and needed glossaries. And here's quite a definition of adaptation. Adjustment to these systems. I think you can see my mouse in response to actual expected stimuli, moderates harm, exploits beneficial opportunities. Some countries wanted to get that in. And they list all these types. I'm listing that, just pointing out here that there are actually 6 pairs in this definition. Natural human systems, actual or anticipated, moderate harm or beneficial opportunities. Adaptation came in kind of a complicated way, designed by a committee, lots of people wanting to shoehorn things in, leaving adaptation kind of sloppy and amorphous. Mitigation is real simple. You reduce the sources of the greenhouse gases. You don't put so much in the air or enhancing the sinks. Plant more trees, they'll soak up the carbon. So it's just one pair. This difference in definitions is a second source of tension. It's a couple points I've used the phrase the twin pillars, because it seems that mitigation and adaptation only work together. The two things we do, we want to harmonize them and combine them. They're not. So there are tensions between them. They've sort of evolved as improvisations, compromises. So one point where they came together was this tagline: avoiding the unmanageable, that's the mitigation, and managing the unavoidable, that's the adaptation. Took a little while to track this down to this 2007 document from groups kind of on the side. United Nations Foundation is an NGO that supports UN activity. Sigma Psi is a scientific organization. So how do these compose the space of climate action, of climate thought, and do they really collaborate so neatly? So here's another point of collaboration. This is the first of the figures. I'm not going to totally delay with all of these because there's a number. Trying to think the right pace for these figures. I'll take a little time with this because this was a huge compromise. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours to produce this figure, which has a nickname, the Propeller Diagram. It's showing you've got this climate risk, and risk is a concept which we at CGT love. It's tied to various theories of the emergence of modern society, Ulrich Beck, risk society, regulatory state, growth of expertise, many concepts. It works well here, partly because it brings adaptation mitigation into alignment. It's what climate change is doing and we don't like, and that comes from these climate change impacts. Not just the world is getting warmer, but getting water means that people die of heat prostration. Water evaporates from reservoirs, crops wilt, animals die. So you don't want these risks. And to manage the risks, they kind of come straightforwardly from the natural hazards on the climate side. And then there are two that come from the socioeconomic processes, and that's the natural and the social science. And social and economic processes affect exposure. Are you in the? Are you gonna? Is the hurricane gonna hit you? And vulnerability, is your house gonna be knocked over? And so here, adaptation and mitigation actions somehow influence these. This word pathways that sort of popped up here is gonna return again. So we're seeing here another collaboration. Adaptation and mitigation brought side by side. Here's a clearer view of the figure. I could have switched to the slide a moment before. You can see how adaptation and mitigation fit together. And so there's this wonderful source. This is the only source I've bolded and put in a bright color because I really want you to write, if you want, write this down. Earth Negotiation Bulletins at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. They basically leak what goes on in these closed approval sessions. And so they say that this figure, the paragraph that explains this figure, created an extensive discussion. If you want to know what the government of St. Lucia, a small island state in Saudi Arabia, said about this, and the Russians and the Brazilians and the Austrians, they were all arguing about this, and they all voted yes to this figure. So 2014 seemed like everything was just nicely aligned. That's why I really think of this as the history of adaptation, and really showing that this history is one of tensions and collaborations. And there's a bit of both. There's a question of how those go together, and that remembering that figure with the propeller meant that there is a spot for adaptation. You can't just have mitigation. So mitigation is easier to measure is one of my points. Here's, this is the third of the tensions besides the whether adaptation is a moral hazard or how hard it is to define. It's just harder to measure. Mitigation is about those greenhouse gas concentrations, and they head steadily upward. This is parts per million. It's measured on a volcano in Hawaii. It goes up and down a little bit each year, and that's because of forests. The more trees and more land in the northern hemisphere and more trees. So those trees every spring soak up a lot of CO2. You're going to be watching that in the next month when all those leaves come out around wherever you are listening to this. You'll realize that the CO2 concentrations are going to drop, and then they're going to go up in the fall. In the autumn, the leaves drop and decay and release CO2, but it heads upwards. You can measure that. And you can really tie a lot together. This is a lot going on in this figure, but it's pretty clear that there are connections here. These are cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So how many gigatons of carbon dioxide has been emitted since 1870? As that goes up, you have different concentrations in parts per million. We're currently here. We're somewhere, I guess we're at 420, so we're not quite here. And that corresponds to a certain amount of mean warming. So you can link the amount of CO2 that's been released, the amount that's in the air, because those create these ovals for different concentrations, the amount of warming, and then you have the risks. Unique and threatened ecosystem systems, so you can think of coral reefs, extreme weather events like Sandy, distribution around the world. Those go from lower risks in yellow through orange, red, and purple, these colors. They love these colors. You can see undetectable, moderate, high, and very high levels of risk. And then, so risks depend on CO2 emissions, would in turn depend on annual greenhouse gas emissions over the next decades. This is what the Green New Deal is trying to get, what Biden is proposing as we speak. Do we reduce emissions, and this is by the percentage, or increase them? And as we increase or decrease them, we move to different ovals. So if we stay where we are, if it stays flat, we're going to end up with more than 2 degrees warming, no question. And that's going to be a big mess. Point, though, is that you can really measure adaptation. And then this is tracing various pathways. This is like what we're planning to do in 2010. This is what will happen with the Paris Agreement. There are these are different measures. And this is the one that's going to get us down to 2 degrees. This is the one that's going to get us to 1.5. So you can really measure this. Whereas adaptation, here is a recent 2019 figure trying to show what adaptation can do. And so this says, just to take a moment with this, this says, let's look at what adaptation will do to help us with sea level rise. Let's list 4 places in terms of types of settings in terms of their exposure and vulnerability. Resource-rich coastal cities, that's us. Urban atoll islands, that's the capital of the Marshall Islands, or these other small island states. In between are tropical deltas, the Mekong, certainly the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Arctic communities. And R is no to moderate response. R is maximum potential response. This is like not too much warming, depending on how much we do by 2100. This is a lot of warming. And that's this amount of emissions is tied not to temperature, but to sea level rise. But all of these are moving up, by the way, the estimates of sea level rise going up and up. But so we've got these different levels of warming with higher levels of risk. The levels of risk are higher as you go from left to right across these 4 settings. These are the most vulnerable. But the left bar is always darker than the right bar because the right bar is showing more adaptation. But this is sort of mixing and matching a lot of research. This is the state of the art, is this is still pretty vague, and it's looking at adaptation in one very well-studied setting. Could continue with some of this. 2010 was an emissions gap report done by the UN Environmental Program. Adaptation, and this says, are the Copenhagen Accord, that's what came before Paris, pledge is sufficient to limit warming to 2.5 or 2 or 1.5. Here's the adaptation gap report, which is later and is still struggling with frameworks. This is the emissions gap, not the mitigation gap, because we know precisely what we want to measure in mitigation. We don't know for we don't know for adaptation. Here's another figure, another one of these conceptual figures. This is like last year. This is saying this is increasing climate risk levels from the past to today to the end of the century. Sort of just a very generalized abstract level. It's deliberately avoiding the precise colors that you saw in the other figures to not make it seem like there are any numbers here. And so this is saying, if you don't have adaptation, there's going to be more risk than with adaptation, whether you're in the high red pathway or the less emission blue pathway or the in-between black pathway. We're going to come down some. Virtually certain progress, uncertain progress, let's do something. Here's an effort to actually see what countries are doing. So this from that report is assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation planning. So this is just seeing our countries even planning by number of countries, 196 of them, and we're seeing that there are some things that they do. So this is what they are doing, what they're starting, this is what they haven't done, no data. So there's a few things that they're doing, that they're listing options that may address risks. Horizontal integration means, do you think about energy supply when you think about water? Do you think about health when you think about food? But they're not really implementing, they're not doing much monitoring and evaluation, and this is just summing across countries, including a lot of very small island states that are trying to develop their plans. So hard to do adaptation. Here's that risk propeller, again, kind of conceptualized, showing you can reduce hazards, you can plant mangroves to stop, again, sea level rise. Mangroves can make the incoming waves lesser. You can move people inland so they won't be exposed. You can give them insurance so they won't be vulnerable. You'll be left with some limits of adaptation. You're going to get a smaller propeller, but you're going to be stuck with the risk. One of the reasons this is important is that they compete for funding. Copenhagen Accord, 2009, not a complete success, but here is, actually I believe you can see the slide. The Copenhagen Accord talks about scaling up new and additional predictable and adequate funding. They have had such a hard time getting funding, so these are just like, these are very moderate ways of expressing immense political tensions. We need new and additional funding. It has to be predictable. It can't just be Norway says, okay, here's 20 million. All of a sudden, it's got to be coming steadily, provided approaching US 30 billion a year with balanced allocation between mitigation and adaptation. And it makes sense to say that it's going to be balanced. It makes sense that they're going to give an overall total because that's easier to measure, easier to track. It makes sense they're going to say that you want to integrate them, balance them, but that leaves the question wide open how you balance them. They, by the time we get to the Paris Agreement, the amount that they want to give is stepping up. It's now 100 billion by 2020. But once again, there's the question of how do you combine them in, they want to combine them in Paris. So that this was kind of the preamble. Developing country parties shall provide financial resources to assist both with respect to mitigation and adaptation. This word shall, I mean, people spend a lot of time debating shall, should, may, or could. It's a great exercise in modal verbs. And I think here we go. Should aim to achieve balance. They like that word balance between adaptation and mitigation. Easier to get people to agree on balance. And some of it is really just kicking the can down the road. People have challenges. It's not that it's hard to measure. You can measure the impacts of mitigation will, the advantages of conducting mitigation can be measured because you can measure the risks. Much harder to measure those for adaptation where you've just got these very fuzzy sorts of diagrams. That leaves the space open, and in fact, it's in some ways, people just postpone coming to terms. The Paris Agreement in 2015, everyone thinks, what a triumph. We will wait to 2023 to see whether all of the things that people agreed to have really come to pass. It's now 2021, so that's 6 of the 8 years to the Paris stocktake, and they still haven't worked out the terms of the accounting for funding. How do you track funding? How do you combine loans and grants, pledges? How do you decide which development funding might count as adaptation funding or mitigation funding? They've always talking about how they're going to resolve that. We're hoping to do that last year in the Conference of Parties. It was going to be moved from Brazil when there was, till Bolsonaro came in, and moved to Santiago, Chile, till there was major social movements, and then it was going to move to Madrid, and then there was the pandemic. So here is mitigation and adaptation competing for funding. This is, they are able to kind of track in certain ways. This is showing countries on the left who's giving. This is a little hard to read, but this is adaptation over here. Mitigation, you can see, is bigger. This is both. This is no information. So you can see that the segment of it could be both, or we're not sure which it is still a lot. So that's one of the tensions. I'm going to point to two collaborations, and then I'll just about be done. One of the things that brings mitigation and adaptation together is that they both face limits. There are many ways that we know we're facing limits. There's certainly the youth climate movement, very powerful. More extreme events, more wildfires, floods in Australia, you might have seen in the paper today. There is the report on limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, very powerful. So we're really running out of time. And so these are the two things that we thought we were going to do. And these mitigation and adaptation have to get along, because there are these really scary things they don't want to do. One is geoengineering on the mitigation side, putting dust into space. Elizabeth Colbert wrote Under a White Sky. Really scary. Loss and damage is when countries like the small island states show up and say, look, what's happened to us is beyond what we can adapt to. We're needing to all migrate. We are facing these kinds of impacts that are beyond the limits to adaptation. Where's the compensation? And so there have been discussions about that since 2013. Paris kind of agreed if they just constructed a large house for the debates, there was a little shack off someplace where the loss and damage group could come and could meet and report yearly. But they really need to do both. And there's this emerging linkages. I mentioned pathways. This is a diagram of the solution space. And people in the climate policy world love this term solution space. So solution space, let me say, first of all, people like the word solutions. You want to say that there are things that you can do. This kind of tracks pathways. We're over here. This is, stuff is happening. The solution space might get larger if laws and regulations, maybe they improve them. I honestly don't know why extreme events would increase rather than decrease it. Technological innovation would expand it. But some other kinds of changes like sea level rise might begin to reduce the scale of the solution space. So societies can kind of make choices and take pathways and sort of move along here, and the solution space narrows. When climate change grows more rapid, it narrows more. So this is, these diagrams are just fascinating. This phrase pathways really links mitigation and adaptation, because any country's pathway includes both. It sort of serves as a map. It serves as a diagram. It serves as a space. It powerfully suggests that you might exit the solution space but be able to re-enter it. But maybe, what are these? You've left the solution space and it's a dead end. Here's another dead end. These diagrams, which are certainly in the process of evolving, have really represent the tension of this language, the efforts to bring mitigation and adaptation, which are really very awkward companions. Mitigation so precise, adaptation loose. They're trying to, though they want there to be more funding, they're competing for that funding at the same time. Different countries are voicing these. So I'm gonna, I don't know how many, some of you may know the Hitchcock film, The 39 Steps, 1935. The man on the left is rushing to protect Britain. The film was set in 1935, had the Nazis in power in Germany, had the British feeling quite scared, and he is trying to track down someone who wants to smuggle secrets of the British air defense out of Britain. He's got a very limited amount of time to do it, and he's had to draw this woman together with him to help him. He, in fact, was being pursued by the spies when he was in a train and saw this woman alone in a compartment and started kissing her, so that they went past him. He's had to persuade her that she too wishes to join this. So here basically is mitigation. Here's adaptation. They're handcuffed because that was part of the pursuit. And the question is, rather than saving, they were able to save the British air defense by working together in clever improvisations. Will the planet, facing a kind of urgency that Britain faced in the mid-30s, may not have the heroes handcuffed, able to save them? So just got a few minutes over. I'll stop and happy to take some questions.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Ben. There is much to discuss. Since we already have a question from Deborah Cohen. Hi, Deborah. I think maybe we could just start there. I have some questions too, but you know, I honestly am interested in what our colleagues and our fellow webinarees, our audience, has to say. So let's just, I can read Deborah's question, and we can start there and then kind of go as we go. She says, Ben, thanks for the stimulating, informative presentation. In keeping with yes, as an historian, speaking like with your historical perspective here, I'd be interested in hearing from you about the deeper history of the study of adaptation by anthropologists. Anthony Oliver Smith has said that much of early anthropology was effectively focused on adaptation. Yeah, interesting. And by which I suppose he means the study of culture's functional responses to their environments. You see the current field of adaptation science as continuous with this much older tradition in anthropology, or a departure from it. It's also an invitation to say more about anthropologists' contributions to recent adaptation research. So
I, of course, am very positively disposed to anthropologists' contributions and to the long and complex legacy of adaptation. It's much of that research took place here at Columbia when the anthropology department was organized under very different theoretical frameworks than the analytical frameworks than the one it has now. Briefly, I would say, yes, there is some continuity. The geographers, who are very strong in the climate policy space, also are highly attentive to Gilbert White, who talked about responses to natural hazards. So I think that word has continued. But I think but I also see some differences. I think in some ways, some anthropologists are kind of disgruntled that we don't get more credit for the earlier anthropology. You can kind of connect the dots to the sort of early emergence of the word adaptation in the 1990s and the very early 2000s. I think there's also an important. I'll add that the word adaptation has a second history at Columbia Teachers College with human adaptation and education as a process of individuals becoming adapted. And I've also been struck with the word resilience, which has quite popular and has a separate history, also applies to individuals as well as to societies and systems. But if I had to say it more briefly, I could say, yes, there were some connections from the early anthropology to the current climate use, but I think it's pretty decoupled by this point.
All right. Well, actually, one of my questions is, let's say, thematically related. It's more directly to the, kind of anchored in the present, less historically, but in fact, would have to do with this kind of the relation between continuity, historical and otherwise, within these traditions, whether they are the cultural and linguistic habits and usages that we've developed with these terms, and we could add some of these graphs in there as well, and their potential interruptions. So, in other words, if would it be meaningful to suggest that what this discourse calls adaptation has in some degree been occurring? It's basically what human beings do when they inhabit an environment. They adapt to the exigencies and the hazards and the risks of that environment. They shelter themselves. They do these kind of things. What has changed, the new element, is marked more in the mitigation graphs and so on, where you hit a threshold point, 1.5, whatever it is, and there's potentially an inflection point, a tipping point, a moment of crisis that disrupts that continuity, which is one of the ways I'm asking also this, because it seems to me it's one of the ways in which ideologies get embedded, and certain things are naturalized in concepts like adaptation and resilience, even sustainability. If you want to ask what is going to be sustained with sustainability, then these kinds of continuities, certain status quos, including the imbalances between global north, global south, and such. So anyway, thoughts about continuity and change.
So certainly, I'm actually going to pick up that bit about how things seem natural and that these are sort of universal and self-evident. There have been, there are times where these, both the science and the policy documents that are sort of very slowly produced and then approved and revised in a big hurry, and they look kind of smooth once they're printed, bear some of the traces of the lack of tidiness of the thought. And so sometimes you get bunches of synonyms kind of coexisting for a few years and then one emerges. I mentioned that in the context of adaptation because there's the word coping that used to be used a lot, like coping strategies. People sometimes talk about survival. You would think you would know what survival is, but that's also a muddy concept. So adaptation kind of grew and swallowed those up and occupied the whole space. I've tried to think, could adaptation mitigation have broken into 3 terms rather than 2? But a couple things I want to mention is that I think the COVID examples, which some people turn to, the question of the vaccine versus sort of the distancing and the masks and the hand washing, that goes together with the discovery of infection, the history of managing infectious disease in the 19th century, where you certainly want to close down the polluted wells, the discovery of the London well and cholera, but you also want to have the use of antiseptics. So is one of those mitigation, one of those adaptation? I'll say, as I think about this as well, another field that comes in, it's easy for us at universities to think of academic disciplines. We hold our degrees in them. We sometimes teach in departments associated with them. But what has come forward is there's a field, kind of an emerging, there's a well-established interdisciplinary field called risk analysis. Societies, journals, programs, and so they have typologies of ways of addressing risk. And so mitigation and adaptation align neatly with the, do you get an umbrella or do you come in out of the rain kind of thing? And that stands in a certain kind of contrast to the Ulrich Beck analysis that really sees some of these as being more systemic. So that risk analysis, that's one of the communities that's really become central in this climate policy. And then the geographers, disaster risk reduction, that's also been important. I could continue, but I think I just want to leave space for other questions too.
Well, actually you began, there are 2 more questions right
now. Oh my God, Bernard and I went to high school together.
Oh, okay,
Are you kidding?
Well, you
Bodan.
began answering Bodan's question about, I don't know if you can read it, right? Where and how do pandemic preparedness, adaptation, mitigation interweave in your schematics? So maybe you want to continue along in that thread that you began with and walk down memory lane, I suppose.
Sure,
But,
no. He was a class ahead of me, and
okay.
his sister Larissa was behind me, and there was a younger sister who's a sculptor. Anyway, there are two answers. One is there's a question of climate change and health, and there are many places where the links are very direct, where warming can cause disease vectors to spread, or there can be extreme. There's a lot of fatality associated with extreme heat events, but then you can also have impacts on housing, impacts on sort of on food supply. The pandemic really seems to be much more linked to the biodiversity side of things, that if we had more intact ecosystems and treated wildlife differently, we would have fewer diseases passing from animals to humans. What it does show, many people feel that it shows powerfully the way that the world can change sharply, and how disruptive things can get. Some people like the word climate weirding, which is it's the climate weirding I take as the counterpart to the tidy listing of risks. A lot of the assessments list risks one by one and make little maps of where they appear on the world and how bad they'll be under different levels of warming. And then a lot of people are saying, no, it's actually that the risks all combine, that you get the heavy rains after the wildfires means that there are the floods, and then the transportation's disrupted. So you go from like solutions, solving things one at a time, to all hell breaking loose, and weirding is the name for that. The pandemic illustrates that. The pandemic, I think, also shows some of the limits of the intergovernmental organizations. The World Health Organization was certainly faced limits in the way that it proceeds. Those would be a couple of lessons. There's a question of whether there are lessons for coordination. We're not seeing we're once again having inequities and injustices both within and between nations very much exposed.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, so our Andrew Wells, our host, our CGT host, has a question about how and whether, I suppose, and how does the future of climate migration factor into the formulation and understanding of the concept of adaptation? So migration and adaptation.
I'm smiling because we have that's if you want to dive into so global thought enables me to see that there's this dilemma of whether whether migration is or is not an adaptation. It's certainly, lots of people are getting out of harm's way. They're going to places where things are better for them. They're choosing to go there. They hope to go there. Why is it not an adaptation? There's, going back to Debbie's question, there are earlier discussions of forms of mobility, in sometimes a preferred phrase to migration. You might have pastoral nomadic pastoralists who go from summer pastures higher up to pastures lower down. In fact, in Habsburg Europe, that Debbie knows well, there's lots of that in the Alps. And then some of that could be the whole history of human settlement in the Pacific in some ways is an adaptation. But some countries are very uncomfortable talking about adaptation because it's so sensitive to their national sovereignty. The International Organization on Migration sits very awkwardly in the UN framework because migration is precisely the sort of thing that it's almost impossible to reach agreement about, even to define the terms. For the upcoming IPCC 6th assessment report, I'm one of the people working on, we have a special section on migration, and just coming to talk about it is difficult. it's also one of the reasons why it's difficult, and again, something that we can see from global thought, and this links with Roz Morris and the work on settlement, is that in fact, in fact, as we like to say at the IPCC, we like to imagine that there are facts and numbers and how firm we are. Many of the people whose mobility or displacement move within countries, so that a lot of the people who face climate hazards, impacts, stay within the country. Of the ones who move internationally, so many of them move within the global south. Zimbabweans in South Africa, Afghans in Iran, South Sudanese in Uganda. But it's the global north that just what is such a problem for Biden at our southern border is very much what the European Union faces with migration from across the Mediterranean. And so migration just becomes hard to speak about because it's so connected to so many things. So, well, could go on, but that's.
I actually wanted to ask a little bit about these images in relation to these kind of wicked problems, because in a way, you mentioned how balance was a term, and of course migrations is, migration seems to be kind of bracketed as some kind of externality to this, even though it is so fundamentally tied because in some sense it unbalances everything. The equilibrium, however precarious that may be, that allows Europe to imagine itself as such, is it's kind of something existential about this question. But there does seem to me a kind of, let's say, a recurring habit to reproduce symmetries in these diagrams. You mentioned the pairing of terms, but like, for example, in the propeller is so overdetermined by its shape, that there's no possible way that even if you kind of gave tried to index everything numerically, that it would balance out in quite the way that, all these different risks and hazards and so on. So it strikes me as though somebody is transferring the sort of language of investment, and specifically of balancing risk in a portfolio, this many bonds and this many stocks, just to make sure, and into some sort of balanced portfolio of risks, hazards, mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies. So I don't know if this comes up, and maybe you can, if you want to testify from within the IPCC, it'd be interesting to hear whether anybody is willing to, in a sense, accede to acknowledge that this whole thing begins with asymmetries. It begins with imbalances. It's sort of, if you like, its natural state is imbalanced, not balanced. Whether that might change the conversation or the nature of the debate, either internally or publicly.
So this is, you said it begins with imbalance, and you said one more thing, and I wasn't scribbling fast enough. Well,
no, I was just saying, the whole the rhetorical structure of the images, and to some extent in the language, seems overdetermined by a desire and a kind of desire for or a discourse of balance.
So, yes, okay, lots to say, very productive. I will think about this. That key phrase in the United Nations Framework Convention talked about stabilization. So that word stabilization, we're eternally promising, which in a way is a return to a stable world, or to only having there were climate fluctuations before climate change. Little ice age, for those who know about it, made a huge difference. It was cold enough here in the 18th century that the British could take cannons on the ice from the battery to Governor's Island, which is pretty amazing. But so some fluctuations, but you want to return to something stable. And so that's one piece there. But I think I'm really thinking about those symmetries, the balance. I've thought quite a bit about the pairs, because in this review paper I'm writing, I do play up with this idea of the pairs as kind of a rhetorical strategy. That's actually the way that the glossary definitions are hammered out around tables, or at least the times I've seen that. I don't think they're totally committed to always having two items. They could have lists of three, but the two work well. There's an emerging new pair of incremental and transformational change. But I think the idea of balance, so I like this idea of balance and symmetry. There's an appeal to order. The notion of optimization comes up all the time. Some of that, I mean, there are a lot of economists and engineers both love optimization. The idea of, as you say, a stock portfolio that's balanced is optimal. And so, and that ultimately comes back to this desire for control in a world with wicked problems and chaos and weirdness. You had mentioned the word existential, and it's a weird kind of, this is a story that in a way is kind of humorous. One of my IPCC colleagues from a previous report, he and I were going to write a paper on the challenges to the habitability of the Earth. There's a book about the uninhabitable Earth, and there are many people talking about the areas the work hours in Karachi in Pakistan are changing. It used to be that you'd start in the morning and work to the early afternoon, and they now have people working early in the morning, then working again in the evening, because too many people die when they work in the afternoon. It's just too hot and humid. So we were doing this paper on habitability, and the mountain areas where we both work provide examples. There are villages that have left because there's simply no water. So we were working on this paper on habitability, and he said to me, "Ben, no, we need to write a paper about existential threats instead. That's more important than habitability." So we're trying to do this very tidy, he's a physical geographer, so we're doing this very tidy IPCC-like review of how do people use the word existential threat? What are the 6 dimensions? Let us find cases, and we will. So that word existential is, I think it's really, and we're talking a lot about, we're talking about representation. In a way, people are screaming. There's this wonderful little post in the Onion of a climate scientist walking through crowd, shouting danger, no one observing them as they walk through all the people. And so I think there's so another what I'm writing down here is just thinking about how the acceleration creates not only kind of urgency, but it creates a need to use always stronger language. That
Yeah.
And so there's this.
Oh, what happened? Froze. I don't know. Ben, can you hear me? Oh, let me see.
Sort of last chance.
There, you're back. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, it froze up, at least on my screen.
Sure.
So I missed that last part. But we do have one more question. I wanted to, since you're doing your study on existential crises, one of the things I had in mind in that with that expression was the perceived existential threat, the threat to the European imaginary by migration, which imagines, the sort of racial imaginary of Europe is in a sense revealed for in its overdetermination with respect to borders and such, when migration is perceived as such a threat. Whereas in fact, if you changed the terminology and used a term less threatening, let's say, like hospitality, that would put the onus on the northern countries and so on to accept migrants, climate migrants, and any other, and recognize their responsibilities as members of a larger community, then, you know, it does seem that anyway. It seemed to me that the imbalances and asymmetries in those relations are to some extent revealed when one community, which is not really threatened to the same degree, perceives itself as threatened in relationship to those who are, as you said, existentially threatened and therefore really have to move. You know.
So it's another way of thinking of who's handcuffed to whom.
Yeah, right.
And that actually, that might be a point. That's another powerful point of the pandemic, which is that if the wealthy countries get lots of vaccines and the poor countries don't, then we're just going to get more variants, and nobody's going to be safe till everybody's safe.
Yeah. Right. So to conclude, we have one more question from Jesse McDevitt Irwin, who asks, how has the realized concept of adaptation been mediated by existing structures of power, both within and across international actors? So
I would broadly talk about how projects can be labeled as adaptation, how they get formulated, how they get approved, how they get funded, how they unfold. So for all the talk, lots of talk about indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, participation, the kind of multiple forms of governance, there's unsurprisingly a lot of reproduction of interests. So the money that gets spent on the donor countries, the developing countries that are writing a lot of the checks, want to steer projects in certain sorts of ways. National elites play a heavy role. That's why the 6 years after the Paris Agreement, some of the details of the basics of accounting have not been. Some of the questions have not been resolved. It's just too challenging. There's been creation of many different forms of climate finance, many types of climate adaptation, and that multiplication in a way allows many small groups to grab little pieces and keeps them advancing and probably helping reduce risk, but with many inefficiencies and unintended consequences, and also a lot of reproduction of inequality.
On that inevitably unhappy note, but nonetheless urgent note, we have in fact reached our allotted time. And so in the absence of further questions, I think we can just conclude and look forward to another lunchtime opportunity, perhaps around a table again, to continue the conversation. So thanks, Ben, so much. And thanks all for joining. And we'll see everybody next time. Take care.
Great. You well?